All of the innovators that we work with have technologies that are specifically designed to help address problems of poor people in developing countries. So for example, we work with medical technology companies that have diagnostic devices for people who have no access to doctors or to labs. For example, diagnosis for cancer on a cell phone. We work with agricultural technologies or agricultural companies that have technologies specifically helping or supporting smallholder farmers. For example, technologies that enable smallholder farmers to connect to finance and connect to markets, or drip irrigation that's on a small level, or post-harvest methods to help farmers preserve their crops after they've been taken from the field. And then in other areas as well, we work in water, in ICT and communications technology and so on. But the target or the goal of what we do is always to use technologies to improve people's lives in developing countries. Sometimes yes and sometimes no. And we only work with technologies that are addressing a need which is particular to developing countries. But I think that very often what happens is you have technologies that have one use or one application in a developing country, and they may have an entirely different use. So for example, there's a company called Home Biogas in Israel that has biodigesters that take plant waste and animal waste and turn it into cooking fuel. So that's wonderful in places where people don't have access to different sources of energy or to other cooking fuels. But in the United States or globally, they make a very good business selling to people who choose to live off-grid and are not connected to electricity sources and have the resources, and then they price differently. So the amount they would charge a person in a developing country who has no other option is much lower than the amount they charge someone in an off-grid community living in the US. Unfortunately, it's very hard to make a sustainable profit in emerging markets. And so sometimes what happens is companies will supplement their income from rich countries in order to be able to do things that provide real impact in developing countries. All of them have a very important role because the private sector is better than any other sector at innovation. Governments are not great at innovation. NGOs don't normally have the resources needed to do technology innovation as well. And so innovation is inherently a private sector driven activity. Having said that, if you want to bring technologies to the level of villages and poor communities, you need someone to help you do that, and nobody understands development on a community level better than civil society does, or local governments, or so on. So the partnerships that develop between companies and NGOs often are win-win partnerships. NGOs have goals like reducing child mortality or increasing nutrition levels, and companies can use innovation to help them achieve those goals. And then governments are important as regulators, governments are important to open doors, governments are important to provide some of the resources to make these things possible. So we work with all. The way that innovation works, in a way, is that an innovator wakes up one morning and says, ha, there's this problem, and I think that I can solve it. Now, an innovator can only do that if he knows the problem, if he's familiar with the problem, which is why innovators tend to innovate for circumstances they know and are familiar to them. So if you're an innovator in Tel Aviv or in London, it's much easier for you to come up with a solution for a person who lives in an environment like the one you know of than it is for them to come up with a solution for a problem you might not have heard of. So one of the things we do in our program is we do a lot of work to educate innovators and help them get exposed to challenges they might be able to address. We have a program called the Pears Challenge, which is a innovation and acceleration program where we spend months working with experienced innovators and entrepreneurs to help them learn about challenges, learn about needs, learn about market conditions, so that they can think about problems of developing countries and not just problems of Californians. Within private sector activity, it's the reason you involve people locally, like engineers or technologists, is less a matter of sustainability and whether once we put something in, will it last, and more a matter of relevance. There's so many bad innovations that have been developed by brilliant engineers, thinking that they have solutions for contexts they actually don't really understand. So if you want to meaningfully innovate to change people's lives, you need to involve the people you're innovating for, or people who much more deeply than you do understand their context. And which is why we do a lot of work also to connect between innovators in Israel and innovators from local contexts, so that they can come up with products and with services and solutions which make sense for the local needs, the culture, the environment, the challenges.